It's my privilege now to chat to Richard Edkins, and he used to be the school principal at Queen's Girls High in Queenstown. Richard, thank you for travelling all the way to Bloemfontein for this interview.
It's very nice to be here.
Richard, your journey with values and principles, where did it start for you?
My journey started way back in the early 90s. I was appointed as a school principal in 1988 in the old dispensation of the apartheid era. And the very first group of children we took in of non-white or other colour children was 1991. And that brought a lot of its own problems with it. And I realised that the old colonial type of teaching environment, which is what Queenstown Girls High was, wasn't going to work for the new South Africa. I was then fortunate enough to go to a principal symposium run by Stellenbosch University. And at that symposium, coinciding with it, I happened to get hold of Stephen Covey's 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, just coincidentally. And I'd read that book. And while I was at the symposium, I felt like I wouldn't manage. I can't cope with this change of dynamics in education, the cultural change, the impact of race groups and cultural things. So I thought, well, let me rather leave education. But while I was at the symposium and listening to people and also having read Stephen Covey's book, I thought, no, there actually is a way. And it's a principle-centered way, a value-driven way of running a school. And that's where it started.
Richard, you distinguish between values and principles. What's the difference?
Yes, I do. And that I picked up through Stephen Covey's book. If one goes and looks at the writers who wrote on these subjects prior to World War I, the focus was on integrity, humility, courage, justice, patience, those sorts of things. Then after the First World War, there came this new breed of writers, and they concentrated more on the superficial things like put a smile on your face and you'll have a better day, and they were quick fix type of writers. Do this and life will be better for you, and so forth. And Covey says that those are secondary things. They're important to have a positive attitude, but if you don't have the primary, the character things, then the secondary things are not authentic. So the primary ones are the principles. And he uses the analogy of true north. Principles that are faced true north are applicable to everybody across all cultures, all races. Everyone in the world who's thinking clearly would agree. For example, fairness would be a principle, as long as it's facing true north, and I'll give you a bit of that true north just now. Respect, integrity, the whole concept of growth, of maturity, and excellence. Now, to demonstrate that all people accept that, how many people do you know who want to be treated unfairly, disrespectfully, who want to be lied to, who don't want people to help them when they need help, and who are satisfied with just mediocrity when it's something being done for them? So those are the principles some of the principles that one would use.
And those are universal?
They are universal, and they are solid. But you can take a principle and make it a value. So you could take a bunch of crooks or a bunch of robbers, and they could say, we have a value system, which they do. We will be loyal to each other. Now, that is not true north. That is now pointing in some other direction with their agenda. So that is why any group of people can have values, but if they're not focused in true north direction, then those values won't carry any weight. So it's important to have values that people understand the principle comes first and then the value follows after that. So the principle is the one that is pointing to true north. So when you are looking at an organization, you need to explain that. That when I'm speaking about fairness, I'm speaking about universal fairness. I'm not speaking about the fairness of a bunch of crooks who are going to divide the booty equally amongst themselves. And that's the difference.
And how did you start the process in your school community? How did you decide on specific principles and then the values, and how do you start?
We now sat with a school that was multiracial, white kids, black kids, Indian kids, colored kids, different religions. So we needed to find something that was common to all and move away from the colonial type of school which we were. And so I said to them that something that is common to all of us are certain principles that are fixed and are north pointing, which means you can't change them around and fiddle with them. And I used the story of the battleship at sea during the night. And the captain of the battleship noticed a light coming towards them. And he said to his radio operator, "Tell that ship to veer 20 degrees or else we're going to collide with them." And the voice came back from the light and said, "You veer 20 degrees. Well, the captain of a battleship is not used to being told what to do, and he barked over the radio, "This is the captain of a battleship speaking. You veer 20 degrees. And the little voice came over and said, "This is a little sailor, and I am manning a lighthouse." The captain changed 20 degrees. And I used that to demonstrate to them that you cannot break a principle. You will break yourself against the principle. So if you throw yourself against fairness, against integrity, against respect, you won't break respect. You're going to break yourself. So that's how I introduced it to them. And then I said to them, what we need to do is we need to take each grade and discuss all the principles. And I prepared a paper, just a very simple paper that they could see what they had to do. And we chose a principle for each grade. So we had 5 principles.
But you did more than just to identify the 5 principles. You made it a living document.
Yes.
Principles that's actually not something on a wall, but on how you do things in your school.
Yes, indeed.
How did that happen?
Well, firstly, everyone had to buy in. It's truth for the grade 8s. It is respect for the grade 9s. It's integrity and honesty, the truth, telling the truth for the grade 10s. For the grade 11s, it's service. We used Ubuntu, which is a Xhosa term, but we had lots of Xhosa children in the school. And then for the matrics, we used excellence. That concept of constantly improving, the Kaizen principle of the Japanese. So we settled on that. We did put up in the corridors of the school the 5 principles. So they were visually in big letters, permanently put up so that everyone was reminded. But we felt that it had to be a constant reminder. I must say the whole principle-centered way of running a school or value-driven school, you can't introduce it and just think it's going to happen. It doesn't. It's got to be a daily reminder. In a 10-week term, I would spend 2 of my assemblies per term, because I did 10 and the staff shared the other. I would spend 2 of them on each of those principles. Then what we did was we also had a little bookmarker made for each grade, and with a little Bible verse which brought out that principle. And on their birthdays, they would then get one of these from me as a reminder. And they're all different. One has got a 1 rose blooming for grade 8s. Then the grade 9s have got 2 roses blooming. And the Bible verse is, be eager to show respect for one another. highlighting that principle for that grade. And then in grade 10, there would be 3 roses blooming, 4 for grade 11. And then once they got to matric, the full 5 then in bloom. And, O Lord, how excellent is your name in all the earth. So that was done as a constant reminder to the children that when your birthday comes up, then you get it, and by the time you leave, you will have the full set of 5.
Some of the girls return and ask specifically if they've missed something to get it. Is that correct?
That is correct. Some girls came to the school in grade 10, and then they would come and ask me if they could please get the grade 8 and 9 ones, even though they weren't at the school at the time. And we were happy to give them because it was a set of 5. And if a girl lost one, which did happen from time to time, we would replace it. And on the back, I used to write a little message to them, happy birthday and enjoy your day, and sign it and put the date of the birthday. Yeah. It was time consuming, but then if you're going to enter into value-driven schools, you must be prepared to invest the time.
So these were presented by the school principal in his own handwriting to the specific
in his
learner.
office.
In his office.
Yes.
Fantastic. What was the response from your parent community and from the learners when you introduced this?
I think they just thought it was another new fad, you know. This is just a thing that's now another new thing that's coming in, like things happen in schools. Because this value-driven school concept is a long-term project. So it grew, and I think eventually people began to realize that there was value in it. Initially, I think they just thought it was another gimmick. Someone trying a gimmick. But the thing that really made a lot of sense to me was that I only had to have one disciplinary hearing from when I introduced it. Formal disciplinary hearing. I had an occasion with one child who was in trouble, big trouble. Called her mother in with her single parent and said, this is the punishment. Actually, one of the sanctions was she was going to be suspended from school for 7 days. And the mother began to argue with me about it. And the daughter got involved and said, no, Mom, you must remember, everyone has to be treated fairly here. And other children have been punished this way, and I have to have it punished that way as well. For me, that was a validation that the message was getting through the school. What I used to do in assembly, I used to say to the children, grade 8s, all together, what is your principle? And they'd say, fair. Grade 9s, what is your principle? Respect. And grade 10s, what is your principle? Truth. Grade 11 and 12, I didn't do it. They become very cynical then. So I'd just say, grade 11 and 12, you know what yours are. You're big girls. So that's how I did that.
At your school, the principles, the values went hand in hand with character education. Is that true?
In my school, character education was probably the underlying core. So the principles were demonstrating the character that we were trying to build in. We wanted the children to behave properly even when they weren't in school uniform and not at a school activity. It wasn't just school-based. It was for life. It was a life skill. We told them that. And I used to tell them that a gentleman uses a butter knife even when dining alone. I had to explain it a little bit, but we do the right things because we want to, not because the school says we have to. And that was the character ethic that we tried to build in.
How difficult was it to get a buy-in from the parents and the educators and the learners?
Again, difficult initially because people thought it was just a gimmick. But eventually it became a way of life. And that was my whole intention. It's a way of life at Girls High. You come there, you come into a system where people live by the character ethic. The personality ethic is not important. It is important to have a positive attitude. But if you've got a positive attitude, but you're constantly unfair, you're disrespectful, the positive attitude doesn't count for much then. You've got to start with that primary character ethic. And the personality ethic has to be built out as well. It's very important that it be there.
Obviously, it will be very difficult to start this whole process if you don't have very strong leadership in a specific school. What's the characteristics of a leader that can implement values in a school?
You're absolutely right. I think if the principal doesn't drive it, then he needs to have a senior member of staff, or she needs to have a senior member of staff driving it. It's not a top-down system, but it is a system that needs push. There's a very big difference between the two. The Newtonian style of leadership is a top-down structure. It's a bit like the old days where the king was at the top of the pile, and then he had his people below him and the peasants were at the bottom. And peasants couldn't ask questions. They were told, you don't ask questions, you just do what you're told. But a writer, Whitehead, came out with a different point of view, and that was that in an organization, there are people who can lead sometimes better than the appointed leader. So the mantra would be for a Newtonian type leader, shape up or ship out. Do it my way or take the highway. The Whiteheadian leader would say, nobody knows everything, but everybody knows something. That's the leadership style you need if you're going to be successful in a value-driven school. Because there are children who know more about computers than the principal of the school. So the principal needs to realize that that is the case. And of course, the important thing is that if one of the values is fairness, then it applies to the teachers as well. And I told the teachers that if you're unfair to the children, you must not bring them to me for being cheeky if they ask you in a respectful manner, but ma'am or sir, is that fair on me? Because you as teachers need to be under the same rules and regulations and whatever that we've decided on for our value-driven school or principle-centered school. We refer to it as a principle-centered school, but value-driven is fine as long as the values are aligned with the principles that are aligned to true north. They're fine.
Yeah. So it's important for every school community to clearly define their norms and their standards within their specific context.
Absolutely. I think they need to know that it applies to everybody. If parents phoned me and asked me for something which was clearly unfair, I would confront them with that and say, but this school says, because I used to send it out in all my newsletters, it would be on the front page. This is a principle-centered school and we focus on the following 5 principles. That, have you read your newsletter? Because in the newsletter it says that all of us have to be fair to each other. So you as a parent are treating me unfairly by asking me what you're asking me. So the answer is no. I'm based on that.
Last year, when we launched value-driven schools in the Western Cape, one of the most frequent questions was, does it mean we're going to abandon our school rules when we embark on a value-driven school process?
No, it doesn't. You don't abandon your school rules. They become a little bit superfluous because what we did was, with the value-driven, principle-driven school, we redefined what the children needed to hear, and that was, I have rights. So we told them they had rights, and they liked that. However, to balance the scale, you have a responsibility. So you have the right to study at school, but you have the responsibility to make sure that other people can study. But there will be people who will unfortunately transgress. And most certainly there are rules and regulations, and there's a very clearly set out procedure as to how one would follow that. But I can tell you that it minimizes disciplinary hearings, punishment of children. It comes right down and almost becomes a non-event.
Richard, to simply move from a rules-driven school to a value-driven school is hard work.
To move from a rules-driven to values-driven is very hard work. A good analogy would be the space exploration in America, where the astronauts have to be lifted off the Earth. And when Apollo 11 was the first group of astronauts to land on the moon, one had to remind oneself that it took as much energy to get that craft off the ground for the first few miles as it took to do the next 500,000 miles to do the journey. And I would say that that's a good analogy. I would say that initially it is hard work. You have to be constantly on the case. You have to constantly remind your teachers who regard themselves as strict to be strict within the principles. To remind the children that you are going to be taken to task on the principles, not on the rules. So if you broke a rule, you'd be told, but that's unfair. And so to get the terminology, a different language had to be developed. The language of, you have left your books at home. That language had to change to, that is irresponsible, it's disrespectful to me as the teacher. So the language has to change. Lots of energy, lots of effort. But like these big water pump machines on rivers with a massive flywheel, cast iron, to get them going is very difficult, lots of energy required. But once the momentum goes, it carries. And then the children start correcting each other. I don't want to paint a picture of perfection here. You have many problems, but that's why we brought in value-driven. It addresses teenage problems better than rules-driven. It has a better outcome. Rules-driven doesn't have an enduring, lastingness to it. Rules-driven is every day the rules must be applied and they must be monitored. And once you get the character ethic in, children begin to drive from the inside out. They're doing it, they do their homework because they want to, not because the teacher says I have to. That's where you want to go. So it becomes easier to manage people. It became easier to manage the teachers because they also, well, all of my teachers, I didn't know of anyone who didn't buy into it, were happier with the change as it took place over a period of years.
What was the role of positive affirmations in this process?
Well, we used affirmations very much in a academic manner, and I explained affirmations to the children, and I said an affirmation is something that you say in the first person, that you do, which has an emotion to it. So, for example, if you took me, I would say, it's really nice to weigh 85 kilograms, but I don't weigh 85 kilograms. Now, what happens is that your mind cannot hold two conflicting thoughts at the same time. And you might have heard of the picture, which is the young girl and the old lady. And then you might want to use it as a slide. And your mind, you might think you can see the old lady and the young girl at the same time, but you can't. It's not possible. It's flicking from one to the other. It's milliseconds, but your mind cannot hold two conflicting thoughts. So if you begin to tell your subconscious mind through your subconscious mind, I enjoy being 85 kilograms, your behavior begins to change because you always move towards the more dominant picture. So my assemblies were almost always teaching assemblies. So I taught them what an affirmation was. Put it up in your mirror where you do your face in the morning. So they were affirming things that they wanted in their lives, not just school-related, but socially and with their parents, you know. Maybe to say, it really gives me a good feeling when I get on well with my parents, if you are really struggling with them. That affirmation, if repeated enough, will change your behavior. And you've got to change. You can't change your parents. If you change, they may follow you.
If you get an opportunity to address all the school principals in our country at the same time, what would your message be to the school principals?
What I would say to principals today is that we must recognize that the children of today are quite well advanced in certain areas that we adults aren't. And I would say computers, internet, and social media, Facebook, Twitter, and so on. And instead of us kicking against it, let us accept it and celebrate it. But as I would say to them, always come back to the character ethic. Always come back to the principles that are true north. Always come back to fairness, respect of yourself and others, the truth. Look at serving, excellence. And then you'll hopefully keep them away from the negative aspects of the social media which they're playing with. And they'll be fair by sitting and studying during school instead of texting in their pockets. And if they are texting in their pockets, one would accuse them of unfairness. That's unfair. You're distracting others, and that would be my message. Let's embrace what they're good at, but let's bring them back to the character ethic, the principle-driven, the value-driven.
Richard, what tools will you need to embark on this journey?
You have to have tools. If you're going to introduce something and you've got nothing in place, no mechanisms in place to make sure that this can be driven through, it's not going to work. We used 5 tools. The first tool that we taught the children was self-talk, my personal thoughts. And we said to them that you've got to talk to yourself positively. When your teacher says to you, if your teacher, your parent, your mom, dad says to you, you are useless, you need to say to yourself, no, I am not. You don't understand me. Because what you say to yourself is going to lead to what you believe about yourself, which we would call our self-esteem or our self-worth. And as our self-worth builds up, so our performance improves. And as our performance improves, then our self-talk gets better because I did it well. So it's a circle that goes round and round. So the teachers had to be taught to say to the children, but that's not like you. Because before they were saying, oh, Johnny, Susie, that's typical of you. They had to learn to say, Johnny, that is not typical of you. And it's not lying, it's a tool. Because that will put into the mind of Susie or Johnny that, actually, you know what, someone believes in me. My mum, my dad, my teacher. That makes me feel better, so my self-worth goes up. Next time, I'll do better. So there becomes a cycle of improvement. That's the first tool. The second tool is goal setting. If you want to go from your present situation to a better situation, you must set the goal, write it down, it must be achievable. And what you do is you're putting stretch between your present state and your preferred state. And if you put it and hold it strongly enough in your mind, that new thought, that brings your behavior up. And we use a piece of elastic to demonstrate that. We always move to the more dominant picture. The more you focus on the new, the more it will pull you away from the old. The more you're happy to sit with the old, the elastic will just pull you back, even if you've set your goal quite high. So that would be the second one, and the one of setting goals. The Germans call it Gestalt, which means orderliness. The mind always seeks for orderliness. It cannot hold 2 conflicting ideas at the same time. So it's going to move towards the more dominant one. So we'd encourage the children to set themselves goals and explain to them the concept of the elastic band being the gestalt that is pulling you either towards your new goal or holding you back. And of course we encourage them to move to the new goals. The third one would be the affirmations, which is the one I mentioned earlier about always put them in the first person, in the present tense, and make it sound like it's happening already. And what happens with that is the dominant picture is the one that your mind will move towards. And so you will move towards that. The fourth one is one that's used by athletes a lot, and that's visualization. Actually seeing yourself at the point of success before you've got there. That's a tool that will help you to push through because you're seeing yourself at the end already. But for me, the most important one is the fifth one. And it's defined as attitude. We human beings are born with conscience and we're born with dignity. That is my belief. We are born with a sense of dignity and we are born with a conscience. It's been my experience throughout my life that when someone has told me I have to do something, I tend to say, watch me, I don't have to do it. And it's my experience telling children and teacher colleagues, you have to do that the cooperation levels are very low, and then there's always, and if you don't, then there's a sanction. So it was very important for me to get through to the children and the teachers that our language must change. It must be, Susan, I want you to want to do that. That's what I want. You don't have to do it. There is going to be a sanction if you don't. You understand that. I'm not instructing you. Those words are gone out of the school. Never again will we say to a child intentionally, thinking it through, you have to be at the sports practice this afternoon. What we would say to them is, I would like all of you to want to be at the sports practice this afternoon, to imprint that on their minds. Because as soon as you decide you want to do something, then there's no, if you don't, then I'm going to punish you. It's I want to. But remember, rights and your responsibility comes as well. So that for me was, I think, the most illuminating and also the most powerful of all the tools, was changing the language from saying you have to do it, where people then say, watch me, I don't have to do it, to I want to do it. It makes you think when somebody says, listen, I want you to want to wear your uniform correctly. I want you to want it, not me. I want you to want it. Again, lots of hard work, like the Apollo rocket taking off, going to the moon, but big payoff, big payoff. So that would be the 5 tools that we use.
Richard, is this a sustainable model on the long term?
It only works in the long term, so it has to be sustainable. But if you are working in a society with people and you have introduced the model and you have launched it and you've used all that fuel and energy to get it up, and somebody comes and takes a value and points it in the wrong way, then you can destroy it in a very short period of time. If you remember one of those, I think it was Columbus, or I'm not sure which one, Challenger, exploded in midair. It can explode in midair. It needs constant attention. You cannot not. It's the way I explained it to the children was, it's the law of the farm. It's the law of the harvest. You cannot play and at the end of summer go and reap a field of mealies. You must have planted them. Equally, you can plant mealies at the end of autumn, starting in the spring and in the summer, and then just leave the mealies. The weeds will overgrow them, they won't have water. You've got to nurture them, you've got to take the weeds out, which is, attending to children who misdemean. The law of the harvest governs. And if you ignore the law of the harvest, you don't reap.